Starfield is a great and terrible game. I love it while simultaneously hating it. It has incredible detail and nuance and yet massive oversight. How do I take out my gun? It's brimming with content while still missing the fundamentals of gameplay. I do like Starfield simply for the extreme wealth of detailed content, but its glaring flaws might be enough to put off players who aren't quite ready for a certain level of Bethesda jank. The insane amount of loading in Starfield actually reminds me of PlayStation 1 era games. The onboarding experience explains almost none of the game's mechanics and nuance. How do I get off the toilet? And the dead-eyed character dialogue is like 50% of the game, or at least it feels that way. And yet, so much of this game has incredible depth and gorgeous details that I have a hard time putting it down. If you're someone that's on the fence about playing Starfield, I hope I can shed some light on the best and worst qualities of Starfield that'll either trigger you to no end or immerse you into Starfield's amazing missions and deeply reactive game world. For most gamers, I would imagine it'll be a combination of both. Now, let me begin by giving credit where credit is due. The artists are the true heroes of Starfield. Every nook and cranny of this game has incredible detail and thought behind it. I was particularly wowed by the clutter and interior detail when moving through just basic habs or star bases. There's so many little items and knickknacks everywhere, it really makes the world feel alive and is also used masterfully as a storytelling tool. Plus, you can pretty much pick up and interact with everything in the environment, and that alone brings more realism and immersion to this game than anything else. The NASA aesthetics, classic looking spacesuits, giant rocket ship engines, and clunky looking robots give it a fun but also nostalgic type of look, right on the edge of retro futuristic. And impressively, Starfield has created its own fairly unique look, which is pretty hard to do in the saturated world of science fiction. It's Cowboys meets NASA with maybe a few hints of Blade Runner thrown in there for good measure. Now, one of the sad things about Starfield is that all the amazing artistry that's gone into the game is tied into an engine that feels quite behind the times, the Creation Engine 2. A lot of modern game engine tech has spent considerable time optimizing the streaming in and out of assets so that you can get rid of those pesky loading screens. Take, for example, Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor games where you have to, very similarly to Starfield, board a starship, fly up into space, and transition to a different planet and area. They do it very cleverly with no real noticeable loading screens. Compare that to Starfield, which has seemingly more loading sequences than a PlayStation 1 era game. Sometimes you dock on a station, which is a loading sequence. Then you walk up to another door shortly after and are met with another loading sequence. And it's sad because this is a game with such artistry and great attention to detail, and all the sense of immersion is killed by forcing players to load when they want to do something simple like just walk onto their landed spaceship on the side of a planet. You can't get into the interior of your ship without first going through a loading sequence. Considering that this comes on top of poor performance to boot, and it seems like the Creation Engine is really holding back Bethesda in what could have been a much smoother, more enjoyable experience. There's already mods out there to integrate DLSS support and fix up some of the weird black levels in the game. I can't help but wonder what kind of game Starfield could have been if it was on one of the more modern engines and wasn't suffering from so many what seem like unnecessary tech limitations. Even CD Projekt Red are switching away from the Cyberpunk engine, something that seems cutting edge, to use Unreal for their next project simply because it's going to be more cutting edge and easier to work with. Alright, tech rant out of the way, let's talk about one of the best aspects of Starfield. Its side missions. Starfield is massive, and in good RPG fashion, some of the best and most rewarding gameplay comes from going off the main quest lines and getting wrapped up in some sort of crazy side adventure. These are often expertly crafted with a surprising amount of variety to them, and they can even give you impressive new upgrades that'll affect the rest of your adventure. I went on a mission to locate a legendary ship, and with it I got an awesome new spacesuit and a ship that was much better than my starter ship. And the mission involves some really fun shotgun base clearing combat, running into characters who will try to stab me in the back, booby trap puzzles, and robot sentries protecting valuable loot. And that was simply just one side mission in what must be hundreds ultimately. You can become a Wild West deputy solving squabbles around systems, a pirate, you can investigate ancient colony ships. The adventures are vast and truly remarkable. Sadly, the main storyline does feel a bit cumbersome by comparison, with a lot of the main quest line falling into somewhat repetitive tasks. I won't say it's terrible, but the actual gameplay missions ended up feeling a lot more like work compared to the side quests, which ended up being the real treats. And one of the problems that I have with the main quest line is just the boring, basic writing and the sheer volume of dialogue that you have to get through. Every line of dialogue feels like awkward exposition, with characters you just met looking you deep into the eyes and then proceeding to divulge some personal truth, as if to say, this is the part where we bond. Some of your companions try to initiate dialogue trees like divulging their struggles as a father, but it comes at really awkward times, like right in the middle of a mission or firefight that has nothing to do with what they're talking about. And the conversations are often long and uninteresting, which sucks because I'd be more than inclined to listen if I knew they might get to the point in a more entertaining or at least timely manner. And this is likely a result of the extremely open nature of Starfield. You can take or choose not to take a large number of companions with you on your adventures, and their AI has no tact for when to drop their life stories on you. In other games, the NPCs might chat at you while you're navigating an environment together. Not so much in Starfield. You basically pause the game while you cut to a close shot of somebody followed by boilerplate dialogue trees. It feels really dated, and at least for me, not in a good or nostalgic way. Now, of course, a huge aspect of what makes these giant open world games fun is the loot and treasure hunting. If you like looting and being a pack rat, then Starfield has you covered. Everything is pretty much lootable, and most of it serves a purpose, and a lot of it can actually change how you're able to play. The weapons are especially a highlight for me, and again, the artist simply knocked it out of the park here. Classic revolvers and shotguns mixed with modern assault rifles, grenade launchers, and laser rifles. I love the look of these weapons, and they all offer different approaches to combat that can be heavily modified and upgraded to suit your specific needs. There's crafting, cooking, modding, base building, and it all functions off of the insane amount of loot and items that you'll pick up on your adventures. It's also surprisingly quick and easy to loot things. Look at a dead body or container and just hit E on the item you want on the pop-up list of loot. Usually it's ordered in a way where the ammo and meds are at the top, which is what you would most likely want to loot every time. Sadly, this is one of the only UI features that I actually like in all of Starfield. The rest of the looting and storage system is a maze of confusion and inefficiency, which is bad considering just how much of the game's depth is based around it. Your companions can carry loot. When you get too full, you carry loot, your ship can store loot, and even bases can hold loot, and it's all easily accessible in just 20 clicks. That's a joke. I really don't know how many clicks, nor could I tell you off the top of my head what the easiest way is to access all of your stuff. Transferring loot, comparing loot, finding items, and moving things around in this game sucks, and it makes me not want to partake in any of the additional activities simply due to the cumbersome UI. I find myself putting a lot of my skill points into carry capacity and ship inventory so I don't have to deal with the horrific process of comparing and selling gear as frequently. Starfield is also amazingly incompetent when it comes to actually teaching players how to play their own game. There's extensive Reddit threads and YouTube videos explaining basic features that you probably missed even if you're like 40 hours into the game. Like how to simply use all the features on your cutter properly to mine faster and get more challenging ores. The UI doesn't give you key prompts or tooltips for a lot of the important things, forcing you to Google stuff. It's kind of wild how bad the onboarding actually is. And one of the clunkiest aspects of Starfield is the actual space travel. Jumping between systems and planets can all be done through the menu system, but because jumps are usually just auto-calculated fast travels, there's no sense of scale or real traversal time. And this is a gameplay element that's actually really important for open world games, where they deliver a real sense of scale and journey, where it took a long time to get somewhere and things happened along the way, but a lot of that is lost in Starfield. Starfield. Pretty much everything is just fast traveling through a really poorly designed menu system and basic cutscenes. And when the game inhibits your fast travel ability, forcing you to say run back to your ship or go between point A and point B, you basically know that some sort of event is about to trigger. It's another thing that really hampers the immersion of the game. Fortunately, it's not something that you have to deal with too much when you're on a really enjoyable side quest and you're spending a lot of time in one location, but when you're running some of the main story quests and you have to jump around talking to different characters, you spend most of your time in these fast travel sequences only to be led to long dialogue trees, and I find myself wondering when I'm actually going to get to start playing. Now again, you might actually enjoy that part of the game. I'll admit I'm a bit of a snob when it comes to writing and characters, and I tend to not enjoy game writing as much because I think it's often built around task-oriented gameplay, so even the quote-unquote character building lines end up being obvious setups for future events down the road. Now, when it comes to building your own character, the skills and progression mechanics in Starfield are actually quite good, and they can drastically affect your gameplay choices. From being a suave, persuasive protagonist who can talk their way out of any situation, to picking safe locks, to stealthing your way past combat, to captaining the most powerful combat ship ever, you can really sink your skills and development into the type of adventure that you specifically want to have. This is really cool. It's not necessarily new or innovative in the world of RPGs, but the depth of the system and how much it interacts with so much of the massive world is honestly impressive. In these types of games, I don't often find myself wanting to put points into, say, persuasion abilities, but Starfield has me considering it just to experience the different narrative paths. And I do say considering because I'll admit my general approach to Starfield gameplay is to end boring dialogue trees by trash-talking my opponent into a firefight. Ah, the life of a space sociopath. Also, I gotta give Bethesda credit for a truly impressive character building system. I would argue there's maybe even too many customization options for facial features, but if you really want to dial in the look of your character to something you've got in your head, you can probably get it pretty exact. Hey, he's got my beard, guys. We could do it. Not gonna do it. And of course, one of the more advertised features is the spaceship building and flying. However, for me, this whole process ended up being a mixed bag. I really do love the ship editor, and that it gives you a ton of freedom in changing how your ship looks and what features it's going to bring to the table. You can recreate your favorite ship from a sci-fi show or just come up with your own creative, unique designs. The downside is that the spaceship combat is woefully basic, almost embarrassingly so. Basically, you show up to a mission site, pew-pew the bad guys' ships, hit a little repair button when you're hurt, and hit E to loot their wrecks. Once you upgrade your targeting skills, though, you do have the option to start disabling ships, boarding them, killing the crew on board, and potentially stealing them, so there's a lot of cool gameplay there. It's just that the actual combat itself is fairly boring. And this really is kind of one of the major lessons of Starfield. It's not a sim, even in the slightest sense. It's much more of a traditional RPG, where you have spacesuits instead of medieval armor, and instead of mounting on your horse, you fast travel with a pew-pew spaceship. Anyone looking for the realistic or sim-like elements is going to be disappointed with Starfield. And it's not entirely Bethesda's fault on this front. They wanted to make an RPG in space, and a lot of people just assumed that it would incorporate a lot of the space sim stuff that space gamers enjoy. But for the most part it doesn't, and instead it's just a fun change of scenery for what's ultimately a very content-rich but janky Bethesda RPG. Now, Starfield is already and arguably a massive hit. The sales are astronomical, and people will get tons of gameplay out of this experience. The game delivers tons of content and depth, but it just might not be in the ways that you care about. I really enjoy the world that they built and the stylistic choices that they've taken. And some of the mission running is extremely fun and immersive and has kind of wild, zany stuff happening, and when that is going on, Starfield is at its best. Having that true RPG freedom to approach missions in the way that you feel best suits your playstyle, and in addition to that, having the results of the mission potentially reflect on the rest of the game world and your options later in that playthrough. It really does make you feel connected to the universe. However, at the same time, the clunky parts of the game are just embarrassing, especially when you consider that this game spent about 8 years in active development and had a budget of over $200 million. I would expect a lot more quality of life features and frankly just more innovation of the old clunky mechanics. But that old school Bethesda jank is still here, in my opinion, much to the game's detriment. Will this company ever escape its now cliche problems, or will Elder Scrolls 6 also have billions of loading screens and off-putting dialogue zoom-in sequences? Who knows? If the success of Starfield teaches Bethesda anything, it's to keep doing the same thing because people are buying the heck out of it. I don't want to end this first impressions video by saying Starfield is a good or bad game. Some people are absolutely going to love every second that they're in this game world, and that could be for many hundreds of hours, especially once the modding scene really gets up to speed. There's no telling what can be done with Starfield. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a lot of gamers who just don't want to deal with the really poorly executed interface, the travel system, the extremely lengthy and bland dialogue trees. It's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I've enjoyed a lot of my time with this game so far because a lot of the adventure elements are really well crafted, but I also have a hard time not noticing all the little things that are dragging this game down and thinking about just how much better it could have been if Bethesda was willing to just innovate a little. If you're in the mood for a deep RPG with tons of adventure and character building and dialogue trees, then this may scratch your itch. But if you're hoping that Starfield would be a great space game that caters to all of your space game fantasies, you might get annoyed by some of the cumbersome RPG elements. I hope this video gives you some valuable insight into whether or not Starfield is going to be a game for you. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and next up, check out my new podcast that I started with Matimio. It's called the Level With Me podcast. It's great fun. I really enjoy making it with Matimio. It's game-centric. Check it out. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.